Rauschenbusch, you may notice in your packet that we have found prayers by Walter about conferences. And so there's actually a day 1 and a day 2 and a day 3 prayer you might check out. And so now I turn the program over to Dr. William Bryant.
Thank you, Dr. Gushee. I want to echo for the other two members of the convening committee, Priscilla, our warm welcome and a dream come true in this context, and David and everybody here who have made this place spectacular, the azaleas and all the other neat things that are in the woods. It is a great day that is ahead with a lot of work and wonderful presentations. It's my happy task to introduce our first speaker of the day, Dr. Christopher Evans. You can read in your program booklets of the official bio. Chris is the professor of history of Christianity at Boston University. And there are listed his major works. I love the title of the one that has been picked up, of course, from Walter, The Kingdom is Always But Coming, like Walter Rauschenbusch. And he, as Gary Dorian said, has been the convener of 2 important conferences while he was in Rochester. But I want to give just a couple more points to put some detail personally on Chris. He is a Western New Yorker. He hails from Syracuse, and that was once called the Burned Over District, and the Rauschenbusches knew well what that meant. So it is altogether fitting that he would have sooner or later come to Rochester, and you can feel in his great biography what, in fact, a Western New Yorker understands about the whole issue of revivalism and so forth. Chris was educated at Syracuse University and at Boston University School of Theology, and did his doctoral work at Northwestern University, where his mentor was Rosemary Skinner Keller, known to all of us as an important voice in her own right. So, looking at what Chris is going to bring to us, I don't want to take any more time, but to say there are a few people who have taken on the task of trying to understand and write about the life of Walter Rauschenbusch. There is D.R. Sharp, there is Paul Minus, who, by the way, is living in Cape Cod, and sends his greeting to this conference. He was almost able to be with us. He did a significant amount of work in helping to bring about the collection many years ago. And then there is Christopher Evans. So, Chris, we welcome you from the Burned Over District, gone east to Boston, and look forward to all that you have to say about Walter Rauschenbusch. Let's give him a good hand.
Good morning. Good morning. It's wonderful to be at this conference today, and it was indicated last night that this event is not only important, but given the state of what is going on in our world today, it is a timely conference. And I especially am excited about the fact that we have not only established scholars and upcoming scholars, but we have several students who are here. And I hope that part of what this conference will do is get you excited about Rauschenbusch. And you'll see in his legacy a lot of things that will be important for your own study and future work, because I know we have several people here who are going to be future pastors, teachers, counselors, educators, and I praise God for that. That's very important. I do have one important correction from Gary Dorian's otherwise marvelous address from last night. Gary, I'm still a young professor. One of the things that I have always wrestled with, and certainly this was a very important question to me when I was working on my own biography of Rauschenbusch several years ago, and it continues to be something that informs a great deal of my scholarship since that book came out, is the larger question of who was Rauschenbusch as a person, and how does his personality manifest itself in his theology. Details of Rauschenbusch's life are well known, and Gary touched on several last night. A German-American born in Rochester, New York in 1861, Rauschenbusch grew up in a conservative Baptist family where his father served as the longtime head of the German department at Rochester Theological Seminary. After spending a formative 11 years as pastor of a German immigrant church in the Hell's Kitchen section of New York, he returned to his native Rochester to serve on the faculty of Rochester Theological Seminary until his death in 1918. Rauschenbusch was a very prolific writer, and the series for Mercer will bring out a number of different aspects of his work. But he is best remembered for what I always like to call his social gospel trilogy. Christianity and the Social Crisis, published in 1907, Christianizing the Social Order, published in 1912, and his last book, A Theology for the Social Gospel, published in 1917. As Gary indicated last night, the theological concept that most defines Walter Rauschenbusch is the kingdom of God. Using the model of the Hebrew prophets from the Old Testament and Jesus' words from the Synoptic Gospel, Rauschenbusch saw scriptural teaching pointing to the creation of a just society, emphasizing what he and other contemporaries referred to as social salvation. Rauschenbusch pushed for a democratic socialist alternative to the predatory economic practices associated with industrial capitalism. Rauschenbusch was part of a broader historical landscape of late 19th and early 20th century reformers that shaped the social gospel as one of the most important movements in American religious history. These individuals included John Ryan, whose ethical formulations of Catholic social teaching found expression in New Deal economic policies, Jane Addams, the pioneer of the Settlement House movement, Reverend Ransom, who was mentioned last night, African-American civil rights leader and Christian socialist, and Harry F. Ward, one of the most radical American activists during the period between the world wars. These persons contributed to what their peers often called the social identity, believing that religion's chief ends pointed to the alleviation of social injustices. Yet Rauschenbusch's name still stands out as the embodiment of this rising social conscience in American Christianity. And in many respects, we still associate his name primarily with the term social gospel. For many of us here, when we hear the term social gospel, we immediately think of Walter Rauschenbusch. One of the points that I think needs to be said from the outset that really does get to the heart of this question, who was Walter Rauschenbusch, is that Walter Rauschenbusch was, in many respects, always a pastor. Many of the most important figures who contributed to the development of 19th century liberalism, such as William Ellery Channing, Theodore Parker, Horace Bushnell, and another prominent contemporary of Rauschenbusch, the Baptist William Newton Clark, were ministers of congregations. Even though Rauschenbusch spent the bulk of his professional career as a professor in a theological seminary, he always wore his pastoral identity on his sleeve. One of his friends, Rabbi Stephen Wise, commented to Rauschenbusch's widow, Pauline, in 1928, that her late husband's book of prayers, Prayers of the Social Awakening, captured the essence of Rauschenbusch's personality. The spirit of the man is in these prayers. It is that which makes them so precious. Such statements on Rauschenbusch's godly nature were repeated by scores of contemporaries who knew him well, including his first biographer, Rauschenbusch's former student assistant at Rochester Seminary, Doris Robinson Sharp. Chock full of anecdotes, Sharp's 1942 biography captures the magnetic pull that Rauschenbusch had upon people who knew him. Yet, Sharp's biography does veer into hagiography, creating a sentimentalized view of Rauschenbusch that has, in many respects, I think, made interpreting his life since then somewhat difficult. In a review of Paul Minus's 1988 biography of Rauschenbusch in Christian Century, Max Stackhouse, loving prophet. Stackhouse largely supported the commonly held view that Rauschenbusch's central purpose was to set the stage for the more rigorous theological coming of Reinhold Niebuhr. Again, this was a theme that Gary touched on last night. Now, Max Stackhouse, and for those of you who knew him can attest to this, always had a deep love and fondness for Rauschenbusch. However, when you read that review of Minus's book, you really get the sense that Rauschenbusch was kind of a theological lightweight compared to the Mount Olympus of later 20th century theologians like Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Rudolf Bultmann, and of course the Niebuhr brothers. The view of Rauschenbusch as an important but secondary figure in the development of American theology is not only a bias that I think many theologians have carried, but really dominates most of the standard narratives of American Protestantism. Narratives on 20th century Protestantism inevitably will turn to the impact of Reinhold Niebuhr and the broader tradition of crisis theology or neo-orthodoxy. The standard interpretive arc emphasizes how Niebuhr challenged the naive liberalism of the social gospel by calling the church back to a more biblically Reformation-based grounding in human sinfulness and God's sovereignty. My intent today is not to refute the importance of Niebuhr's legacy, although I might take a few jabs during the course of the And the first one is, and a few of my former students have heard me say this, unlike his younger brother H. Richard Niebuhr, I really doubt that Reinhold spent any time, significant time, reading Walter Rauschenbusch. But I also have to say that if you peel back some of the layers of hagiography that you find in Sharp's account, and many of the accounts from some of the contemporaries that knew Rauschenbusch well, you begin to see that Rauschenbusch was not this naive liberal. But you really do begin to see how Rauschenbusch's personality and his life and his experience has left an indelible mark on his theology. And interestingly, I think a very important and overlooked passage that maybe gives us a hint today of who Rauschenbusch was as a person comes from the introduction of Sharp's biography that was written by another Baptist great, Jerry Emerson Fosdick. And Fosdick said this about Walter Rauschenbusch, that he approached the social applications of Christ's gospel by way of a deep, well-informed care of people one by one. While Walter Rauschenbusch's identity will always be linked with the social ramifications of religious belief, his understanding of social salvation, this term that you hear a lot in connection with Rauschenbusch and the social gospel, was inseparable from the importance that he put on the role of the individual. And this, I believe, 100 years after his death, provides us insight in terms of why today Walter Rauschenbusch remains the heart and soul of the social gospel. Historian William McGuire King observes that the social gospel emphasized the fulfillment of personal religion and not its negation. And the more that I read Walter Rauschenbusch, and even after my biography came out several years ago, the more that I believe that assertion to be true. If one examines details of his life, his German-American heritage, his Hell's Kitchen ministry, his lifelong struggles with deafness, his identity as a Baptist, and his teaching career, one sees how the mark of his personality and character is embedded on his theology. And this morning what I'd like to do is examine with you three components of Walter Rauschenbusch's life that frankly I wish I had explored in more depth in my biography, although I have picked up on several of these strands in some of my subsequent writings. Again, I think they tell us a great deal about why we remember Rauschenbusch today and still find the character and the personality of the man engaging. First, Walter Rauschenbusch was an evangelist. One of Dora Sharp's most moving recollections came when he accompanied Rauschenbusch on a series of lectures in Chicago. As the two men were enjoying a meal on the banks of Lake Michigan, Rauschenbusch asked Sharp, "How do you think of me and my work?" Sharp responded, "I think of you as an evangelist, and of your work as evangelism of the truest sort." This response pleased Rauschenbusch, who noted, "I have a positive view of the individual." Rauschenbusch hung on to his father's pietism that highlighted a broader tradition of antebellum Protestant perfectionism associated with early 19th century revivalists such as Charles Finney and Phoebe Palmer. And when Bill alluded to the burned-over district of Western New York, that tradition of perfectionism that had so many manifestations later on in the history of American theology just came out of the pores of many evangelicals who were connected with that legacy. The evangelical emphasis on religious perfectionism believed that individuals could be purged from the power of sin in order to live lives of holiness in thought, word, and deed. This perfectionism was essential to the early 19th century abolitionist and women's rights movements and created an important template for the rise of the social gospel movement after the Civil War, a reality that I think many historians continue to gloss over. The theme of personal holiness was always important to Rauschenbusch. As he noted in an 1897 address not long after he came to the faculty of Rochester Seminary, the main thing is to have God, to live in Him, to have Him live in us, to think His thoughts, to feel His holiness, and to be holy because He is holy, to join in the great purposes of God, and to be lifted to greatness of vision and faith and hope with Him. That is the blessed life. Of all of Rauschenbusch's works, I think two books that in many ways do the best job of summarizing the interrelationship he had between personal and collective salvation are Prayers of the Social Awakening, published in 1910, and a short devotional book that I just love, Dare We Be Christians, published in 1914. Like other social gospel figures, the cross of Christ was always an important reminder to him that Christian discipleship required sacrifice, suffering, and perhaps the cost of one's life. At the same time, Rauschenbusch's understanding of love radiates with a life-giving energy. And for many students here today who are thinking of going into pastoral ministry, I recommend Dare We Be Christian because it speaks to a lot of pastoral occasions. I think that's one of the powers of this book. Rauschenbusch held to a belief in the mutuality and diverse expressions of love, encompassing physical intimacy on one end, with a sense of interconnection that bonded individuals to communities. He wrote, "Love demands sacrifice, and sacrifice seems the denial and surrender of life. Actually, love is the great intensifier of life, and giving our life preserves it. By seeking life selfishly, we lose it. When we lose it for love, we gain it." Rauschenbusch and other social gospel liberals often use terms like the sacredness of personality to describe an individual's quest to become more Christ-like. As historian Eugene McGarrer notes, the social gospel emphasis on personality refers to, in his words, the highest achievement of humanity, sensitivity in feeling, rationality of judgment, and capacity for spiritual insight, all nurtured in a supportive community setting. These themes come through in Rauschenbusch's interpretation of the Lord's Prayer, again, part of the book Prayers of the Social Awakening, and well worth reading. He writes, whereby in prayer we are one with our fellow men in all needs. We are one in our sin and our salvation. To recognize that oneness is the first step toward praying the Lord's Prayer aright. That recognition is also the foundation of social Christianity. There were many late 19th century and early 20th century derivations of what is often called personalism, a movement that would ultimately have a major impact on the theology of Martin Luther King Jr. The belief that we understand God ontologically through categories of human personhood is important for understanding Walter Rauschenbusch, not only in terms of how he talked about his faith, but why he so vigorously detested aspects of capitalism. A movie that I love to show my students is Charlie Chaplin's 1936 film, Modern Times. I really recommend it. You can find it through the grace of God and YouTube. Through Chaplin's slapstick humor, the film represents a very sophisticated critique of early 20th century capitalism. And if you've seen the film, you might know that the first scene shows a flock of sheep, and then it fades into an edit that the sheep fade to a group of hurried workers coming up out of a subway station on the way to their job. Throughout the film, Chaplin really illustrates a number of reasons why Rauschenbusch considered capitalism antithetical to the spirit of Christianity. Its disregard for the individual, its routinization, and most especially its parasitic qualities whereby a select group of individuals accumulated wealth which they did not create. Rauschenbusch attacked industrial capitalism was that it debased the individual worth, making individuals of little or no value to the ends of the larger society. In one of my favorite passages from Christianizing the Social Order, Rauschenbusch summarizes his belief that individuals had a God-given right to a living wage, not just because it was good in economics. As he wrote, the working man must be protected in sickness and age by collective wealth of the community. He must have a recognized property right in the industrial organization. The minimum form of that right is the right to get employment and to stay in his job as long as he does honest and efficient work. How long it will take us to reach this condition, I do not know. That we must move in this direction seems to me clear. A condition in which 1/4 of the race holds all the opportunities of livelihood in its arbitrary control, and the other 3/4 are without property, without access to the earth, and without an assured means of even working for a living, is neither American nor Christian. Now here's a sentence at the end of this that I love. Property is a means of grace, and a good job is another. Despite his times of being of a kind of festering anti-Catholicism, Rauschenbusch does echo aspects of a broader religious tradition of natural law theology that emphasizes that any vision of a just society needs to honor the dignity and worth of the individual in order to have any sort of lasting value. He repeatedly came back to the theme that an individual's personal devotion to God was only fully realized when it was connected to a broader tapestry of community. As he wrote, because we are bound together in unity of life, the good or the evil in one man's soul affects the rest. No torch is kindled of itself, but when one person has lighted his at the altar fire of God, hundreds will take their light from him. My second point, and now we're getting to the serious stuff, given the context of this. Walter Rauschenbusch was a Baptist theologian. He loved his Baptist identity and saw it as the core of who he was as a Christian. "I am a Baptist," he wrote in 1906, "because in our church life we have a minimum emphasis on ritual and creed and a maximum emphasis on spiritual experience." Like his father, he treasured the legacy of the 16th century Anabaptists, yet he valued these traditions for their emphasis on individual freedom and not their sectarianism. Rauschenbusch often spoke the common language of liberal Protestantism of his era, emphasizing applied ethics over doctrine. But he repeatedly worried that too many Baptists were taking obscure doctrines and scriptural texts and creating a religious individualism that would lead them into an unhealthy sectarianism. He used the following anecdote. A nearsighted child was taken to the zoo and stood in front of the lion's cage. The lion's tail was hanging down through the bars. "But I thought the lion was different," said the child. "It looks like a yellow robe." So there are Baptists who have hitherto discovered only the tail end of our Baptist ideals and convictions. And it is no wonder that they turn out as narrow as the tail they devoutly believe in. Specifically, Rauschenbusch worried that this narrow tail was leading Baptists to embrace a theological pessimism that increasingly defined his generation. Perhaps the theological development that most disturbed Rauschenbusch was the rise of apocalyptic premillennialism. He pushed back against the strict biblicism among Baptists who interpreted the Bible as a code book for predicting the end times. Rauschenbusch lived when various forms of dispensationalism were finding a ready hearing among many Baptists and other Protestants. And you still see, in many respects, the continued popularity of this tradition, witnessed by people like Tim LaHaye and the continued ubiquity of various Left Behind films and books. Rauschenbusch frequently voiced his fears about the negative impact upon end-time speculation upon the church's ministry and mission. This apocalyptic hope has always contained ingredients of religious force and value, he conceded in Christianizing the Social Order. However, its trail through history is strange and troubled reading. It has become of absorbing fascination to some Christian minds, but it has led them into labyrinths from which some never emerge. I would say amen to that last one.
Yeah.
Rauschenbusch repeatedly expressed his worry about the popular appeal of dispensationalism and frequently locked horns with some of the most prominent Baptist premillennialists of his generation, including Isaac Haldeman in New York and Mr. Fundamentalist William Bell Riley in Minneapolis. In a 1914 response to Riley's accusation of heresy, Rauschenbusch expressed both his hurt at his accusation, but also his worry that Riley's tactics were against the spirit he treasured in his ministry, Christian unity. "When you charge me with denying the Lord that brought me, you hurt me just as if you charged me with being false to my wife or cruel to my children." Rauschenbusch died before the fundamentalist modernist controversy of the 1920s. But he became, for many conservatives, a symbol of all that was wrong with the so-called modernist position. However, he constantly worried that too many Baptists were being swayed by ahistorical readings of Scripture that characterized many forms of premillennialism. Rauschenbusch saw chief characteristics of Baptist identity: believer's baptism, congregational autonomy, and soul liberty as gifts to the wider Christian movement. For Rauschenbusch, being a Baptist was a means to a greater end, but it was not an end in itself. And I think if he were here today, he'd be heartbroken that many Baptists continue to worship the yellow tail without necessarily seeing the light. And finally, his Baptist identity leads to a third aspect of who he was as a person. Walter Rauschenbusch was a teacher. The primary field of Rauschenbusch's teaching was church history, and those who experienced him in the classroom recall him with a mixture of awe, intimidation, and humor. My favorite account of Rauschenbusch as a teacher was told by one of his former students, Edwin Dahlberg, who many years later went on to become a president of the National Council of Churches. But Dahlberg talks about how he submitted a paper that he knew was subpar. That's putting it mildly. And when he got the paper back from his professor, Rauschenbusch didn't make any comments in the margin. He only wrote one comment at the top. Cock-a-doodle-doo. At some point I've been tempted to try that. I haven't had the courage to pull that off. As Dahlberg makes clear, however, the true nature of Rauschenbusch's theology of love, focused upon the God-given uniqueness of the individual, was manifested in the relationship that he maintained with his former students. The Rauschenbusch family papers are filled with correspondences from his students who frequently sought his vocational counsel, asked him for advice on personal problems, and on occasion debated him. Also, it is important to note, and this again was part of Gary's presentation last night, that Rauschenbusch was a church historian at a time where this was still a relatively new field of theological inquiry. Derived from German liberals like Albert Ritschl and Adolf von Harnack, as well as a Baptist contemporary, Shaler Matthews, Rauschenbusch helped popularize in the United States the belief that Christianity was a historically conditioned faith. While earlier theologians and historians would talk about how history was all determined by divine providence, Rauschenbusch emphasized that church history was as much a story of failure as it was success. Additionally, Rauschenbusch helped popularize the study of American church history, recognizing unique patterns of religious formation in the U.S. at a time when many European Christians tended to see American religious developments as inconsequential to Christendom. Rauschenbusch's understanding of history was at times problematic. At times he could easily equate the kingdom of God with specific institutions of Western democracy, and again, as discussed yesterday, the anti-Catholicism comes out at many phases of his work. Yet in discussing the historical development of Christianity, he was part of a generation that took seriously the way that different beliefs and doctrines emerged out of different historical contexts. While later criticized for being too optimistic about historical processes, Rauschenbusch's view of history did not fall into any sort of preordained outcome as predicated by Marxism on one extreme and dispensationalism on the other. As he noted in Christianity and the Social Crisis, history laughs at the optimistic illusion that nothing can stand in the way of human progress. While Reinhold Niebuhr emphasized historical paradox and irony, Rauschenbusch was under no illusion that historical processes on their own would lead one to a primrose path. If anyone can read history without a sickening sense of the enormous extent of injustice and oppression in all nations, he wrote, he has a mental makeup which I both envy and abhor. Rauschenbusch's optimism never ventured far from his belief that solving the nation's social problems would require people of faith to make tremendous personal sacrifice. Yet he also cautioned that Christians should never see social action alone as a substitute for a vibrant faith. As he summarized it, the church comes to lean on social preachings and doings as a crutch because its religion has become perilous. May the Lord have mercy on us all. All of us who have been trained in egotistic religion need a conversion to Christian Christianity, even if we are bishops or theological professors. Rauschenbusch was optimistic about the possibility of social change in his lifetime, but he was enough of a realist to know that change was never going to be easy. As he stressed in his many letters to tired and burned out ministers, He encouraged them to recognize the ways that their work made a difference, even amid times when they didn't necessarily see the fruits of their labors. As he wrote in the conclusion of Christianizing the Social Order, the sacrifices demanded by a religious conversion always seem sore and insufferable. But every religious person will agree that after the great surrender is made, there is a radiant joy that marks a great culmination of life. Whenever we have touched the hem of his garment by some righteous action, we get so much satisfaction that we can be well content, even if we suffer hurt and persecution for it. Not the memory of power wielded, nor even the memory of love is so sweet as the consciousness that we once suffered for a great cause. Many of us who have written about aspects of Walter Rauschenbusch, and I'm one of them, share Doris Sharp's affection for the person who was often called by his closest friends, Rauschie. In my own research, I found myself caught up in Rauschenbusch's personal struggles, seeing how he was an individual who at times wore his heart on his sleeve. I recognize that as much as I tried to avoid it, I probably veered at times and came close to maybe a little sentimentalism. I was especially struck by Rauschenbusch's deep love for his family, his beloved spouse Pauline, and their 5 children. There is no doubt that Rauschenbusch had a very melancholy side. His struggles with deafness, the attacks of critics, and conflicts in his family could drive him into a depression that is unmistakable in many of his correspondences. But I do reject the argument frequently made that Rauschenbusch died of a broken heart, a man whose theology of love just couldn't stand up to the carnage of World War I. It is indeed unfortunate that American Protestantism lost Rauschenbusch before he had an opportunity to address the confusing theological climate of the 20s and 30s. But it is a testament to the power of his idealism that Rauschenbusch remained the standard bearer of the social gospel in the decades to come. One of the problems with the broken heart thesis about Rauschenbusch's final years is it feeds into the belief that somehow the social gospel just collapsed and disappeared after World War I. And despite his criticism, Reinhold Niebuhr never doubted the indelible core of the social gospel, mainly that the primary thrust of Christianity was to seek a society, just society, through the transformation of social structures. Yet for all the ways that Christian theology has benefited from his critique, and there is, my friends, a time and season to read Reinhold Niebuhr. But I'm not sure that he offers a better way forward to the church. Rauschenbusch's influence, while perhaps muted, has never disappeared in the years since his death, with many of his critiques of economic justice and the Christian's ethical relationship to society becoming foundational to a wide range of social movements, both inside and outside of institutional Christianity. A pertinent example to me of how you can see Rauschenbusch's influence after his death can be seen in the career of one of the most important religious activists of the 20th century, A.J. Muste. Introduced to Rauschenbusch's work as a student at Union Theological Seminary in the 1910s, Muste became one of the most significant religious-based activists in the United States, whose leadership of the Fellowship of Reconciliation played a pivotal role in crafting Gandhian nonviolence as a workable political strategy. Writing in the early days of the Cold War, he offered a salient critique of Reinhold Niebuhr that embodies key aspects of Rauschenbusch's thought. Muste wrote, "The person who undertakes to attain perfection in terms of some individual standard invariably finds that the standard is never deep enough. Only a love that does not think primarily of itself, that has the sensitivity to feel the need of others in concrete situations, that cannot be blueprinted beforehand, is adequate to human need. To be perfect or whole is precisely to be unself-conscious, that is perfectly spontaneous. While conceding that liberals needed to take doctrines of sin seriously, must be worried that too much emphasis on depravity would not necessarily make people more aware of the need for God's grace, but provide rather a rationale to do nothing. He wrote, when we become obsessed with human helplessness and corruption, instead of being caught up in transcending them by the grace of God, we are still preoccupied with self, still self-centered, and therefore still self-righteous. If we do not end with the experience of the grace and power of God as that which overcomes and blots out our preoccupation with our sinful selves, we are but giving another demonstration of the pretension and corruption of humanity. Today I can hear Walter Rauschenbusch's voice making the point that Christian love is not naive. Rather, it is the basis that enables us to carry on in the face of our own doubt and pessimism, to work for justice. Rauschenbusch's words from 1896 might serve us well as an appropriate response to various theologies of pessimism. He wrote that faith in salvation by catastrophe cuts the nerve of action, but only in the unselfish pursuits of life. I have yet to see proof that those who believe in the imminence of Christ's coming are indifferent to the security of real estate titles, the length of leases, the education of their children, and other things that involve a long look ahead. The question is, which will do more to make our lives spiritual and to release us from the tyranny of the world? The thought that we may at any moment enter into the presence of the Lord, or the thought that every moment we are in the presence of the Lord. When we talk about Walter Rauschenbusch being the soul of the social gospel, it's not simply because he articulated unique theological insights. It reflects how his theology embodied his own God-given personality that believed in the potential of persons and faith communities to change the world. As he affirmed in Dare We Be Christians, love is preparing to connect the present and the future generations. To lovers, their love seems their own peculiar joy and apart from all the world. But humanity stands in the shadow behind them and lifts the majestic hands of blessing above them. The indomitable spirit of the race is reaching out in them toward the better days that are to be, and is flinging a new defiance to death as they affirm life together. For all my jabs at Niebuhr, I acknowledge again that there is a time and a place to hear his words. And yet, I don't think social movements are built on a foundation of paradox and irony. Niebuhr's theology gives guidance to movements, but this religious idealism of Walter Rauschenbusch creates them. Rauschenbusch's theology is not perfect. He had many blind spots, some because of his historical era, and others by his own admissions. Yet, in a sense, his personality shaped a vision of prophetic Christian thought that projected a long arc through the 20th century. That legacy emphasizes that Christian love does not exempt us from being under judgment for our failure to act in the face of injustice. As Rauschenbusch wrote, nations die of legalized injustice. And unfortunately, the wisdom of that comment is all too pertinent in our time. In marking the 50th anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King Jr., I hear echoes of Rauschenbusch in King's final Sunday sermon preached at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. In preparing for a Poor People's Campaign on the nation's capital, a march on the nation's capital, King noted that America stood at a historical crossroads when the nation had to decide whether to help bridge the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. For King, the question was not whether America had the ability to get rid of poverty. The real question was whether America had the will. As King and Rauschenbusch remind us, we are all held accountable to the God of history for the ways that we've turned our backs on our Creator. Yet, as Rauschenbusch affirmed in one of his prayers entitled, "On the Harm We Have Done," each day offers us the possibility to be renewed by God's grace and love. And I conclude with these words from that prayer. Change us by the power of thy saving grace, from sources of evil into forces for good, that with all our strength we may fight the wrongs we have aided and aid the right we have flogged. Grant us this boon, that for every harm we have done, we may do some brave act of salvation, and that for every soul that has stumbled or fallen through us, we may bring to thee some other weak or despairing one, whose strength has been renewed by our love, that so the face of thy Christ may smile upon us, and the light within us may shine undim. Thank you. And it's question time.
Yes, question time.
And if you don't mind, too, it would be helpful. I know a number of you here, but if you could just identify yourself and maybe your connection institutionally. Question again, when you look at Sanders and you look at where his vision of democratic socialism took root, particularly in Northern Europe, very secular. It came out of secular movements. Right. So I think, again, this is going on my topic, but I think people in the so-called progressive Christian movement really need to come to Jesus movement right now in terms of what are we doing, how do we build alliances, and really think in terms of how we want to make a difference. So that was a little bit more than you asked for, and I apologize, but I had to take the bait on that.
It's 3 after 10. Who's next?
I'm Tim Floyd. I'm on the law faculty here at Mercer.
Hi, Tim. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Your first point about holiness and perfection certainly had echoes of Wesley and the Methodist and the Wesleyan movement. To what extent was Rauschenbusch, even though a proud Baptist, influenced by Wesley and Methodism?
I think that the roots of that kind of Arminian pietism and a certain tradition of religious perfectionism that certainly had a lot of 19th century roots in Methodism, but went beyond that. I mean, a number of Baptists picked up on that, and even though, again, Charles Finney picked up on ideas of perfectionism, he was a Presbyterian and a Congregationalist. But I think Rauschenbusch very much appreciated Wesley, and certainly when you look at his role within the Brotherhood of the Kingdom, a Baptist fellowship of like-minded Reformed Baptist ministers, certainly Wesley comes up as an influence. And another figure who's very forgotten, not particularly well known in this country, but in British holiness circles, an Irish Methodist named William Arthur, who wrote a book in the 1850s called Tongue of Fire, which ironically was very influential on many Pentecostal movements, but it also really took off again within many people in the social gospel, because it talked about, again, sort of that indwelling of the Spirit. You know, the fact, again, the fact that you can change history, you know, the connection to liberalism, really reflects a kind of understanding of Christianity and theology that is moving in the direction we can make a difference. But the way that we do that is through an understanding of sort of a view of sanctification. The other point, too, and I think this is very important for Rauschenbusch's ministry at Rochester Seminary, Rauschenbusch was very ecumenical, not just on a national level, but on a local level. He was very involved in a number of churches in the Rochester area. He had very close ties with a number of Methodist leaders. And even though he didn't believe in bishops, he could see the fact, well, I can kind of see how bishops could be helpful for an organization. But it's also interesting in that quote how he threw in bishops and theology professors in special need of grace and redemption. Doug Thompson teaches on the